Life had always been kind to Richard Wilson. At 52, he owned one of the most successful investment firms in the city. His home in the upscale neighborhood of Oakwood Hills stood as a testament to his achievements, a sprawling mansion with perfectly manicured lawns, a swimming pool that glimmered under the sunlight, and a garage housing his collection of luxury cars. On this particular autumn morning, Richard woke up earlier than usual. The stock market had been volatile lately, and he needed to prepare for an important board meeting. He slipped into his tailored navy suit, grabbed his leather briefcase, and walked out to his garage. Today, he chose to drive his newest acquisition, a sleek, silver sports car that purred to life at the press of a button. As he navigated through the quiet streets of his neighborhood, Richard's mind was already at the office, mentally rehearsing his presentation. The golden leaves scattered across the road created a beautiful scene, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts were consumed by profit margins, investment strategies, and keeping his shareholders happy. The traffic grew denser as he approached downtown. Richard checked his watch impatiently, 7:45 a.m. He had plenty of time before his 9 a.m. meeting, but Richard Wilson had built his reputation on punctuality. Being early was being on time was being late. That was his motto. Richard turned onto Main Street, where the elegant skyscrapers housed various corporate offices, including his own. The morning rush hour was in full swing. People hurried along the sidewalks, clutching coffee cups, their faces buried in their phones. The homeless population that frequented this area had grown in recent months, a fact that Richard often complained about to the city council. Not that he lacked compassion, but he believed their presence deterred potential investors from considering this part of the city. He was approaching the intersection when his phone rang. Richard glanced down to see it was Thomas, his chief financial officer. The call was likely about the meeting. He reached for his phone just as the light turned green. What happened next would change Richard Wilson's life forever. A figure darted across the street, a thin, shabby man pushing a shopping cart filled with what looked like cans and old clothes. Richard's eyes widened in shock. He slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. There was a sickening thud as the front of his car made contact with the man, sending him sprawling onto the asphalt. For a moment, Richard sat frozen behind the wheel, his knuckles white from his grip on the steering wheel. Then reality crashed down on him. He had just hit someone with his car. Horns blared behind him as he fumbled with his seatbelt and stumbled out of the vehicle. "Someone call an ambulance," he shouted, running toward the crumpled figure on the ground. A small crowd had already gathered, most people with phones in hand, either calling for help or, to Richard's horror, recording the scene. The man he had hit lay motionless on the ground. He wore tattered clothes that hung loosely on his thin frame. His face was partially obscured by a matted gray beard and long, unkempt hair. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. Richard knelt beside him, unsure what to do. "Sir? Can you hear me?" Richard's voice shook. "I'm so sorry. Help is coming." The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing a startling shade of blue, a blue that sent an unexpected jolt of recognition through Richard. Those eyes, they seemed so familiar. But how could that be? I didn't see you," Richard stammered, trying to make sense of the strange feeling washing over him. The homeless man coughed, wincing in pain. "Not your fault," he managed to whisper, his voice raspy. "I wasn't looking." In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder as emergency services approached. Richard remained by the man's side, a strange sense of duty keeping him there. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was something else, something he couldn't quite name. The paramedics arrived within minutes, efficiently moving the crowd back and attending to the injured man. Richard watched as they carefully placed him on a stretcher, checking his vitals and asking him questions. The man seemed disoriented but conscious. "I need to go with him," Richard told one of the paramedics, surprising even himself with the declaration. "Are you family?" the young paramedic asked, eyeing Richard's expensive suit with skepticism. No, I'm the one who hit him. It was an accident. Richard swallowed hard. I need to make sure he's okay. After giving a brief statement to the police officers who had arrived at the scene, Richard followed the ambulance in his dented car. His meeting was forgotten, his phone ignored despite its constant buzzing. For reasons he couldn't explain, ensuring this homeless man's well-being had become his priority. At the hospital, Richard paced the waiting room while doctors examined the man he had hit. He called his office to explain his absence, brushing aside concerns about the meeting. For once in his life, business would have to wait. Hours passed before a doctor approached him. Mr. Wilson? The patient is stable. He has a mild concussion, 2 broken ribs, and various cuts and bruises, but fortunately, no life-threatening injuries. Relief washed over Richard. Thank you, doctor. Can I see him? The doctor hesitated. He's resting now, but he did ask if you were still here. Seemed surprised you hadn't left. Room 213, down the hall. Richard nodded gratefully and made his way to the room. He paused at the door, suddenly unsure. Why did he care so much about this stranger? Was it just guilt, or was there something more to the nagging feeling he couldn't shake? He entered quietly. The homeless man looked different now that the hospital staff had cleaned him up. His hair and beard had been washed and trimmed, revealing more of his face. He seemed older than Richard had initially thought, perhaps in his 70s. Those striking blue eyes opened as Richard approached the bed. You stayed, the man said, sounding genuinely surprised. Richard nodded, taking a seat in the chair beside the bed. I wanted to make sure you were all right. And to apologize properly. The man studied Richard's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. What's your name, son? The question caught Richard off guard. Richard. Richard Wilson. The old man's eyes widened, and a trembling hand reached out toward Richard. Wilson? From Oakwood Hills? Richard frowned, taken aback. Yes, how did you know that? The old man fell back against his pillows, a strange mix of emotions crossing his face, shock, disbelief, and something that looked oddly like joy. I've been looking for you, he whispered. For years. Looking for me? I don't understand. Do we know each other? Richard leaned forward, his heart inexplicably racing. The old man's eyes filled with tears. You wouldn't remember me. You were just a little boy when I left. A cold sensation spread through Richard's chest. What are you saying? My name is Harold. Harold Wilson. The old man's voice broke. I'm your father, Richard. The words hung in the air between them. Richard felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. This couldn't be true. His father had abandoned the family when Richard was just 5 years old. His mother had raised him alone, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. She had died 10 years ago, never knowing what had become of her husband. That's impossible, Richard finally said, his voice barely audible. My father is dead. He must be. We never heard from him after he left. Harold's eyes never left Richard's face. I'm not dead, son. Just lost. Lost for a very long time. Richard stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the chair. I don't believe you. This is some kind of scam. You saw my expensive car, my suit. You're trying to con me. Harold didn't react with anger or defensiveness. He simply reached for the small bag of personal belongings the hospital had placed on his bedside table. With shaking hands, he pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a yellowed photograph and held it out to Richard. Reluctantly, Richard took it. The photo showed a much younger version of the man before him, standing beside a beautiful young woman who was holding a small boy. Richard recognized his mother immediately, her smile as radiant as he remembered. And the boy, there was no mistaking those same striking blue eyes that had passed from father to son. Richard sank back into the chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The photograph trembled in his hands. "Why?" was all he could manage to ask. "Why did you leave us?" Harold's eyes clouded with pain and regret. "That's a long story, son. One I've waited 30 years to tell you." Richard looked at his watch. It was nearly 4 p.m. His entire day had been derailed, yet somehow, that didn't matter anymore. "I have time," he said softly. As the afternoon light filtered through the hospital room window, Harold began his story. He spoke of his struggles with alcoholism and gambling debts, of threats from dangerous men, and of his decision to disappear rather than put his family at risk. "I thought I was protecting you and your mother," Harold explained, his voice heavy with remorse. "I planned to get clean, pay off my debts, and come back when it was safe. But by the time I managed to turn my life around, years had passed. I found out your mother had moved, changed her phone number. She had every right to start fresh." Richard listened, a storm of emotions raging inside him. Anger, confusion, grief, and somewhere beneath it all, a strange sense of relief. The question that had haunted his childhood finally had an answer. "I tried to find you both over the years," Harold continued. "I had some success for a while, even managed to save some money. But then I got sick. Cancer. The medical bills took everything. By the time I recovered, I was back on the streets. That was 15 years ago." 15 years? Richard's voice cracked. "You've been homeless for 15 years? Harold nodded sadly. "Life has a way of humbling you, son. I've learned that the hard way." As Richard sat in that hospital room, facing the father he had believed dead for decades, he realized that the collision on Main Street that morning had been more than just a physical accident. It was as if fate itself had intervened, bringing together two lives that had been separated for far too long. "I don't know what to say," Richard admitted. "I've spent my whole life thinking you abandoned us because you didn't care." "Not a day went by that I didn't think of you," Harold replied, a tear slipping down his weathered cheek. "You were the reason I kept going, even when things seemed hopeless. The dream of seeing you again someday." As the hospital room grew dimmer with the setting sun, father and son sat in silence, the weight of 30 years of absence between them. Richard knew that one conversation couldn't heal all wounds or bridge all gaps. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings were all you needed to change the course of a life, or in this case, two lives that had collided in the most unexpected way. Night had fallen by the time Richard left the hospital. He sat in his car for several minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, unable to process everything he had learned. The father he had believed dead or permanently gone had been living on the streets of the same city where Richard had built his empire. The irony was almost too much to bear. As he drove home, the empty mansion that had once represented his success now felt hollow. Richard wandered through the spacious rooms, seeing them through new eyes. How many homeless people could be housed in this space? How many meals could his weekly grocery bill provide for those without? Richard poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank into his leather armchair. Harold's words echoed in his mind, "Life has a way of humbling you, son." Sleep eluded him that night. By morning, Richard had made a decision. He called his office and informed them he would be taking a personal leave of absence. Thomas, his CFO, was shocked but capable of handling things in the interim. When Richard returned to the hospital later that day, he found Harold sitting up in bed, looking stronger than the day before. The old man's face lit up when he saw his son, a reaction that stirred something deep within Richard. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," Harold admitted. Richard pulled up a chair. "I almost didn't," he confessed. "I spent all night thinking about what you told me. About your life, your choices." Harold nodded, his eyes reflecting decades of regret. I wouldn't blame you if you walked away. I deserve that. Maybe you do, Richard said quietly. But that's not why I'm here. He took a deep breath. The doctors say you can be discharged tomorrow, but you need proper care for those ribs to heal. Harold's expression darkened. I appreciate your concern, but I don't have anywhere to go. The shelter only allows 14 consecutive nights, and I used most of mine last week. Richard straightened his shoulders. You're coming home with me. The words hung in the air between them. Harold stared at his son in disbelief. Richard, you don't have to. I want to, Richard interrupted. I'm not saying I forgive you, or that we can just pick up where we left off 30 years ago. But I'm not going to let my father live on the streets when I have a house with 5 empty bedrooms. Tears welled in Harold's eyes. I don't deserve your kindness. This isn't about what you deserve, Richard replied honestly. It's about who I want to be. The next day, Richard helped Harold into his car. The old man had few possessions, just a backpack containing changes of clothes, a worn journal, and a few photographs. His shopping cart of collectibles had been lost in the accident. As they drove to Richard's home, Harold gazed out the window, taking in the changing landscape from downtown to the affluent suburbs. You've done well for yourself, he observed. Richard nodded. I worked hard. Put myself through college on scholarships and part-time jobs. Mom was determined I would have opportunities she never had. She was always the strong one, Harold said softly. How is she? Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She passed away 10 years ago. Heart attack. Harold closed his eyes, absorbing the blow. I always hoped to apologize to her someday. They rode in silence the rest of the way. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had prepared the guest room as Richard had requested. Her eyebrows raised slightly at Harold's appearance, but she said nothing, maintaining her professional demeanor. Richard appreciated her discretion. This is your room, Richard said, showing Harold into a spacious bedroom with an attached bathroom. Mrs. Chen comes 3 times a week. If you need anything when I'm at work, she can help you. Harold stood in the center of the room, looking lost among the luxury. This is too much. It's just a room, Richard said, though he understood Harold's discomfort. The contrast between this and wherever his father had been sleeping was stark. Over dinner that evening, a simple meal that Mrs. Chen had prepared before leaving, Richard and Harold attempted conversation. It was awkward, filled with long pauses and careful navigation around painful subjects. Tell me about your business, Harold finally asked, seemingly eager to focus on his son's accomplishments rather than his own failures. Richard described Wilson Investment Partners, the firm he had built from scratch after working at various financial institutions. He explained his philosophy of ethical investing and his recent interest in funding affordable housing projects. That's why I was heading downtown yesterday, Richard explained. We're backing a development that will include units for low-income families and individuals transitioning out of homelessness. Harold smiled sadly. You're doing good work. Very different from the path I took. It's not too late to change paths, Richard said, surprising himself with the words. Later that night, after Harold had gone to bed, Richard sat in his study reviewing old family albums. Photos of his childhood, birthday parties, school events, holidays, all missing the same person. He wondered what those moments would have been like with a father present. The following days established a tentative routine. Richard returned to work, though with shorter hours. Harold slowly recovered, gaining strength and a healthier appearance with regular meals and rest. They shared dinners, gradually filling in the decades-long gap in their knowledge of each other. Richard learned that Harold had actually managed to stay sober for 20 years before his illness triggered a relapse. He discovered that his father had worked as a carpenter when his health permitted, that he was well respected among the homeless community for helping newcomers navigate shelter systems and services. Harold, in turn, learned about Richard's college years, his first business ventures, his brief marriage that had ended amicably but without children. He absorbed these details hungrily, as if trying to rebuild the relationship they might have had. One evening, about 2 weeks after Harold had moved in, Richard came home to find his father in the kitchen, apron tied around his waist, stirring something on the stove. "Mrs. Chen showed me where everything is," Harold explained. "I used to be a decent cook, back when." He didn't finish the sentence, but Richard understood. "Back when he had a family." "Smells good," Richard said, setting down his briefcase. "Your mother's beef stew recipe," Harold said. "At least, how I remember it. She always added a splash of red wine." As they sat down to eat, Richard realized this was the first meal his father had cooked for him in 30 years. Such a simple act, yet it represented something profound, the beginning of healing, of building something new from the wreckage of the past. "It's exactly how Mom used to make it," Richard said after the first bite, though in truth, he barely remembered his mother's stew. But the smile that spread across Harold's face made the white lie worthwhile. That night, as Richard was about to head upstairs to bed, Harold called out to him from the living room. "Richard, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned at the hospital." Richard felt a chill run down his spine at his father's words. He slowly returned to the living room and sat across from Harold. "What is it?" he asked, bracing himself for more difficult revelations. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a worn envelope tucked in his shirt pocket. "I wasn't completely honest about why I left all those years ago." Richard tensed, preparing for the worst. Had his father committed a crime? Was there another family somewhere? The gambling debts were real, Harold continued, but there was something else. He handed the envelope to Richard. "I was sick. Very sick." Richard opened the envelope and pulled out yellowed medical documents dated 30 years earlier. His eyes scanned the diagnosis: early-onset Parkinson's disease. "The doctors told me it was progressive," Harold explained quietly. "Back then, the treatments weren't as advanced. I watched my father die from the same disease, the tremors, losing control of his body, becoming a burden on everyone around him." He looked down at his hands. "I couldn't bear the thought of you and your mother watching me deteriorate." Richard studied the documents, his mind racing. "So you left because..." "Because I thought it would be easier for you both to think I'd abandoned you than to watch me slowly die," Harold finished. "It was selfish, I see that now. I convinced myself I was protecting you, but really, I was protecting myself from my own fear." Richard set the papers down, overwhelmed by this new information. "But you're still here." "The disease progressed much slower than expected," Harold nodded. The doctors were surprised. "I still have symptoms, the tremors come and go, worse when I'm tired or stressed. Living on the streets made it harder to manage." Richard thought back to the slight shake in his father's hands that he'd attributed to age or withdrawal. "Does it hurt?" he asked, a childlike question that surprised even himself. "Not physically," Harold replied. "But watching your body betray you bit by bit, that hurts in other ways." Richard stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, yet it didn't make his father's absence any easier to accept. "You should have told us," he said finally. "We would have faced it together." "I know that now," Harold admitted. "Fear makes people do foolish things. I've had 30 years to regret my decision, to imagine how different our lives might have been." Richard turned back to face his father. "Why tell me this now?" Harold sighed deeply. "Because if we're going to have any kind of relationship moving forward, it needs to be built on truth. And because I need your help." "What kind of help?" There are treatments available now that weren't an option before, medications, therapies. But without insurance, without an address. Harold trailed off. Richard understood. His father wasn't asking for luxury or comfort, he was asking for a chance to fight the disease that had already stolen so much from both of them. "I'll help you," Richard said simply. "We'll find the best doctors, get you whatever treatments you need." Relief washed over Harold's weathered face. "Thank you," he whispered. The next morning, Richard made some calls. By afternoon, he had arranged an appointment with a leading neurologist who specialized in Parkinson's disease. The doctor could see Harold the following week. After finishing his calls, Richard found his father sitting on the patio, watching birds at the feeder. He seemed at peace, as if unburdening himself of his secret had lightened some invisible weight. "I spoke to a specialist," Richard said, joining him. "Dr. Lee can see you next Thursday." Harold nodded gratefully. "You know, when I was living on the streets, I used to see your company's name on buildings downtown. I'd read about you in discarded newspapers. I was so proud, yet so ashamed to reach out." "What changed?" Richard asked. "Why were you on that particular street the day of the accident?" Harold smiled sadly. "Your mother's birthday. Every year on her birthday, I would walk past your office building, just to feel close to you both. I never planned to make contact. But fate had other ideas." Richard absorbed this information, imagining his father keeping this annual ritual, standing outside his building while Richard worked inside, neither aware of how close they actually were. "Life is strange," Richard mused. "All these years, we were in the same city. We might have passed each other a dozen times and never known. Or maybe we did," Harold said quietly. "Maybe some part of me recognized you in that moment before the car hit. Maybe that's why I didn't move out of the way in time." The thought sent a chill through Richard. Had some unconscious recognition slowed his father's reflexes? Had fate orchestrated their reunion through a near tragedy? Either way, Richard said, "We have a second chance now." Harold reached out tentatively and placed his hand over his son's. "I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful for it." As they sat together in the afternoon sunlight, Richard realized that forgiveness wasn't a single moment but a journey, one they were both just beginning. The days leading up to Harold's medical appointment were filled with small, significant moments. Richard took time off work to help his father prepare, buying him new clothes and ensuring he ate well. Each meal, each conversation slowly bridged the 30-year gap between them. One evening, Richard brought out a photo album his mother had meticulously maintained. "I thought you might want to see these," he said, placing it on the coffee table between them. Harold opened the album with reverent hands. His eyes filled with tears as he traced a finger over photos of Richard's graduation, his first business award, holiday celebrations, all the milestones he had missed. "Your mother did a wonderful job with you," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "She never spoke badly of you," Richard admitted. "When I asked where you were, she would just say you had to go away. As I got older, I assumed the worst, but she never confirmed my suspicions." Harold closed his eyes briefly. "She was a better person than I deserved. She kept your wedding photo on her nightstand until the day she died," Richard said quietly. It was a detail he'd never shared with anyone. The revelation seemed to physically affect Harold, who hunched forward as if in pain. "I wish I could tell her how sorry I am," he whispered. Richard nodded, understanding the impossible wish. Some regrets could never be fully resolved. Thursday came quickly. Richard drove Harold to the neurologist's office, both men silent with anticipation. Dr. Lee was a petite woman with a kind smile and straightforward manner. She reviewed Harold's old medical records, conducted a thorough examination, and ordered several tests. "The good news," she told them afterward, "is that your disease has progressed more slowly than typical cases. Your symptoms are manageable with current medications and physical therapy. Harold seemed to deflate with relief. So I'm not going to deteriorate rapidly? No one can predict exactly how Parkinson's will progress in any individual, Dr. Lee explained carefully. But with proper treatment and care, many patients maintain good quality of life for years, even decades. As they left the clinic with prescriptions and follow-up appointments scheduled, Richard noticed a new lightness in his father's step. The fear that had haunted Harold for 30 years, the fear of rapid decline and becoming a burden, had been somewhat alleviated by modern medicine and knowledge. We should celebrate, Richard suggested impulsively. They went to a small restaurant by the waterfront, nothing fancy but with good food and a peaceful view. As they ate, Harold shared stories from the missing years, jobs he'd held, places he'd lived, people he'd known. He spoke of his sobriety, his relapse after the cancer diagnosis, and his eventual life on the streets. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort, Harold confessed. It was the invisibility. People look right through you when you're homeless, as if acknowledging your existence would somehow make them vulnerable to the same fate. Richard thought about how many times he himself had avoided eye contact with homeless individuals on his way to work. The realization made him deeply uncomfortable. I want to do something about that, he said suddenly. Harold looked up, curious. What do you mean? My company has been investing in affordable housing projects, but that's just writing checks. I want to be more directly involved. Richard's mind was racing with possibilities. There should be a program to help people transition from homelessness, not just housing, but medical care, job training, support services. Harold smiled at his son's enthusiasm. That sounds wonderful, but these problems are complex. The system has a lot of gaps. I know people who can help fill those gaps, Richard insisted. Doctors, lawyers, business owners. People who could volunteer time, resources, expertise. As Richard outlined his vision, Harold watched with a mixture of pride and wonder. This successful man who could have turned his back, who had every right to remain angry, was instead channeling his energy toward helping others like his father. Back at home, energized by their conversation, Richard began making notes at his desk. Harold shuffled in, holding a worn journal. I've kept this for years, he said, placing it on the desk. Writings, observations, stories from the streets. Things people told me, things I saw. If you're serious about this project, maybe some of this could help. Richard accepted the journal with surprise. Thank you. I'd like to read it. Not all of it is pleasant, Harold warned. Life on the streets rarely is. I need to understand if I'm going to make any difference, Richard replied. Later that night, after Harold had gone to bed, Richard opened the journal and began to read. The pages contained not just Harold's experiences, but the stories of dozens of others, veterans with PTSD, women fleeing abuse, young people aged out of foster care, individuals battling mental illness or addiction. Each entry was written with compassion and insight, revealing a side of his father Richard hadn't fully appreciated. Harold had been more than just a homeless man, he had been a witness, a confidant, and in his own way, an advocate for those society had forgotten. As Richard read deep into the night, a plan began to take shape, one that would not only help rebuild his relationship with his father but might change the lives of many others as well. Morning light filtered through the curtains as Richard awoke at his desk, Harold's journal still open beneath his cheek. He had fallen asleep reading the powerful stories his father had documented over the years. Stories of resilience, despair, small triumphs, and crushing setbacks, all written with an observant eye and a compassionate heart. Richard made coffee and continued reading as the house gradually came alive with morning sounds. He was so engrossed that he didn't notice Harold enter the kitchen until his father placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've been up all night?" Harold asked, concern evident in his voice. Richard looked up, his eyes tired but bright with purpose. "Your journal, it's incredible. The people you've met, the stories you've collected, they give a voice to experiences most people never hear about. Harold poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from his son. When you're invisible to society, sometimes all you want is for someone to acknowledge that your story matters. It more than matters, Richard insisted. It's valuable. It could help shape better approaches to homelessness. Over breakfast, Richard shared his emerging plan. He wanted to create a foundation, one that would combine housing assistance with comprehensive support services. What made his idea different was that it would be informed by the actual experiences of people who had lived on the streets. "I'd like you to be part of it," Richard told his father. "Not just as inspiration, but as an advisor. Your perspective is irreplaceable." Harold seemed taken aback. "Me? I'm just getting my life together again. I don't know anything about running organizations." "But you know everything about what works and doesn't work in the current system," Richard countered. "You've lived it. Most of the people making decisions about homeless services never have." The idea took root over the following weeks. Richard used his business connections to assemble a small, committed team, a social worker, a doctor who volunteered at clinics for the unhoused, a lawyer specializing in housing rights, and a real estate developer willing to think beyond profit margins. Harold attended these preliminary meetings with trepidation at first, uncomfortable in Richard's world of boardrooms and business attire. But when the discussions turned to service delivery and program design, his contributions became invaluable. He pointed out flaws in well-intentioned ideas and suggested practical improvements that only someone with lived experience could identify. "The problem with most shelters," Harold explained during one meeting, "is they separate families. Men go to men's shelters, women and children to another. Many people choose to stay on the streets rather than be split up from their loved ones." The team listened and took notes. Richard watched with growing pride as his father's confidence increased with each session. The tremor in Harold's hands was less noticeable too, the new medication regimen already showing positive effects. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting, Richard found Harold sitting on the back patio, gazing at the sunset. "You were impressive today," Richard said, joining him. Harold smiled softly. "It feels good to be useful again. To think that my years on the streets might actually help others. I've been thinking," Richard began carefully, "about making this official. Registering the foundation as a non-profit. We could call it Second Chances." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "A fitting name. And I'd like to tell our story," Richard continued. "Not just as a way to launch the foundation, but to change how people think about homelessness. To show that anyone could be one illness, one job loss, one bad decision away from losing everything." Harold tensed visibly. "You want to tell people about us? About how we reconnected?" "Only if you're comfortable with it," Richard assured him. "But think about it, a successful businessman hitting a homeless man with his car, only to discover it's his long-lost father? It would get attention. Attention means funding, and funding means we can help more people. It would mean exposing my failures to the world," Harold said quietly. "My abandonment, my illness, my time on the streets. I see it differently," Richard replied. "It's a story about reconnection, about seeing the humanity in every person on the street. About how any one of them could be someone's father, someone's child." Harold considered this for a long moment. "Let me think about it." Days passed as Harold mulled over the proposition. Richard didn't push, understanding the enormity of what he was asking. Going public would forever change their still fragile relationship. Meanwhile, Richard continued reading his father's journal, drawing inspiration for the Foundation's programs. One entry particularly struck him, about a talented artist Harold had befriended who couldn't maintain housing due to untreated bipolar disorder. "What happened to him?" Richard asked one morning, showing Harold the entry. A shadow crossed Harold's face. "He died last winter. Exposure." The stark reality of that simple statement hung in the air between them. Later that afternoon, Harold found Richard in his study, working on foundation documents. "I've made my decision," he said. "We can tell our story." Richard looked up, surprised by his father's certainty. "What changed your mind?" "I visited some of my old spots downtown this morning," Harold explained. "Saw some familiar faces. People who helped me when I had nothing. People who still have nothing." He paused, his blue eyes, so like Richard's own, filled with determination. "If our story can help them, then my pride doesn't matter." Richard stood and embraced his father, an act that still felt new and somewhat awkward, yet increasingly natural with each passing day. "We'll do this together," Richard promised. "Every step of the way." The following weeks brought a whirlwind of activity as Second Chance's foundation moved from concept to reality. Richard secured office space in a downtown building he owned, hired a small staff, and worked with lawyers to establish their nonprofit status. Harold's health continued to improve with regular medical care, and his involvement with the foundation gave him renewed purpose. The question of how to share their story remained. Richard had contacts in local media but wanted to approach it carefully. The last thing he wanted was to create a sensationalized narrative that missed the deeper message. "What about Joe?" Harold suggested one evening. "He's a good man, trustworthy." "Joe?" Richard asked. "Joe Phillips. He runs a small online news site focused on community issues. He used to bring coffee and blankets to folks under the bridge during winter. Really listens to people's stories without judgment." Richard was intrigued. "Not the typical media outlet I would have considered, but maybe that's exactly why we should talk to him." The meeting with Joe took place at the newly established foundation office. Joe turned out to be a thoughtful journalist in his 50s who had started his news site after becoming disillusioned with mainstream media's coverage of social issues. "I want to understand what you're hoping to achieve by sharing your story," Joe said after introductions. Richard and Harold exchanged glances. It was Harold who answered. "We want people to see the humanity in every person on the street," he said. "And to understand that homelessness isn't just about poor choices. It's about systems that fail people when they're vulnerable." Joe nodded, taking notes. "And you're comfortable with me telling the full story? Including the circumstances of your reconnection?" "The car accident is what people will remember," Richard acknowledged. "But if it gets them to pay attention to the real message, then yes." The interview lasted hours, with both men sharing painful truths and hard-won insights. Joe listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing them to tell their story in their own words. "This will take me some time to write properly," Joe said as they concluded. "I want to do it justice." 2 weeks later, Joe's article went live under the headline, "Collision of Fate: How a Wealthy Man's Car Accident Reunited Him with His Homeless Father and Inspired a Mission to Help Others." The story spread quickly, first locally, then nationally. Other news outlets picked it up, reaching out for follow-up interviews. Richard and Harold carefully selected which requests to accept, prioritizing those focused on homelessness issues rather than the sensational aspects of their reunion. The foundation's phone began ringing constantly. Donations poured in, from small contributions to substantial grants. But more importantly, people started sharing their own stories, of family separations, of times when they had been close to homelessness themselves, of relatives they had lost to the streets. "It's overwhelming," Harold admitted one evening as they reviewed the day's correspondence. "I never imagined our story would touch so many people. It's given them permission to talk about things that are usually kept hidden," Richard observed. "The shame, the fear, the close calls." Among the messages was an email that particularly caught their attention. It was from a small group of business owners who had been inspired by Richard's example and wanted to start similar programs in their own communities. "They're asking if we'd be willing to consult with them," Richard explained to Harold. To help them understand how to set up effective support systems. Harold looked thoughtful. You know, this could be bigger than just our city. What if we created a model that could be replicated elsewhere? Richard smiled at his father's expanding vision. Their relationship, so recently mended, was now giving birth to something neither could have imagined that fateful morning of the accident. One step at a time, Richard said. But yes, I think we're onto something important here. 6 months after the car accident that changed everything, the Second Chances Foundation hosted its first major event, the opening of a transitional housing complex named Wilson House. The building, a renovated hotel Richard had purchased, would provide not just shelter but comprehensive support services for 50 individuals and families working to leave homelessness behind. On the morning of the opening ceremony, Richard found his father standing in front of the mirror, struggling with his tie. Harold's hands were shaking slightly, partly from nerves, partly from his condition. "Let me help you with that," Richard offered, stepping forward. As he adjusted his father's tie, Richard noticed the transformation that had taken place over these months. Harold stood taller now, his face healthier, his eyes clear and purposeful. The raggedy homeless man from the accident scene was gone, replaced by a dignified elder with wisdom etched in the lines of his face. "Nervous?" Richard asked. Harold nodded. "I never thought I'd be speaking in front of all those people. What if I freeze up?" "Just speak from the heart," Richard assured him. "That's what got us here." The ceremony drew a sizable crowd, city officials, donors, community members, and most importantly, the first residents who would be moving into Wilson House. Richard had insisted that the event prioritized their needs and comfort rather than impressing donors. After Richard's brief introduction, it was Harold's turn to speak. He approached the podium slowly, his prepared remarks forgotten as he looked out at the gathered faces. 3 decades ago, I made a terrible mistake, Harold began, his voice quiet but steady. I walked away from my family because I was afraid. Afraid of illness, afraid of being a burden. That fear cost me years with my son. It eventually cost me my home, my dignity, and nearly my life. The crowd listened in complete silence. 6 months ago, by some miracle I still don't fully understand, my son's car hit me on a downtown street. That accident should have been the end of my story. Instead, it was a new beginning. Harold gestured toward the building behind him. Wilson House isn't just a building. It's a statement that everyone deserves a second chance. That no one should be defined forever by their worst moments or their biggest mistakes. He turned slightly to look at Richard. My son taught me that. He could have walked away from that hospital room once he learned who I was. He had every right to. Instead, he opened his home and his heart. Tears glistened in Harold's eyes, but his voice remained firm. Each person who walks through these doors has a story as complex and human as mine. They deserve the same chance I got, not just shelter, but respect, support, and the opportunity to rebuild what was lost. The applause that followed was thunderous. Richard stepped forward and embraced his father, no longer awkward in showing affection. As the first residents began moving in later that day, Harold helped welcome them, showing them around with the understanding of someone who truly knew what they were experiencing. Richard watched from a distance, witnessing his father's natural ability to connect with people who had walked similar paths. One of the foundation's staff approached Richard. Your father is amazing with them. They trust him immediately. Richard nodded. He understands their journey in a way I never could. You've built something remarkable together, she observed. We're just getting started, Richard replied, watching as his father helped an elderly woman carry her few possessions into what would be her first stable home in years. 1 year to the day after the accident that had reunited them, Richard and Harold stood together on the rooftop garden of Wilson House. The space had been transformed into a vibrant community area where residents grew vegetables and flowers, a symbol of new life taking root. Hard to believe it's been a year, Richard said, gazing out at the city skyline. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday, and other times. Like we've been doing this our whole lives, Harold finished. The Second Chances Foundation had flourished beyond their expectations. Wilson House was at capacity with a waiting list, and plans for a second location were already underway. Their model had been adopted by organizations in 3 neighboring cities, with consultation requests coming in from across the country. What had begun as a personal reconciliation had evolved into a movement, one that emphasized dignity and comprehensive support over temporary solutions. Richard had stepped back from his investment firm, appointing Thomas as CEO while he focused on the foundation. Harold had become something of a mentor to the residents, running weekly support groups and helping individuals navigate the challenging path back to stability. "I've been thinking a lot about your mother lately," Harold said, his voice soft with memory. "She would have loved this place." Richard nodded. "She always believed in second chances. She gave them to her students all the time." His mother had been an elementary school teacher, endlessly patient with struggling children. "I have something for you," Harold said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, worn photograph. "I've carried this for 30 years. Richard accepted the photo. It showed his mother, young and smiling, holding him as a toddler. Harold stood beside them, his arm around his wife, looking at his family with unmistakable love. "I never stopped loving either of you," Harold said. "Even when I convinced myself that leaving was the right thing to do." Richard carefully tucked the photo into his wallet. "I know that now." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the city in golden hues. Below them, the sounds of dinner preparation drifted up from the community kitchen where residents took turns cooking meals. "You know what today is, don't you?" Harold asked. "The anniversary of the accident," Richard replied. Harold shook his head. "That's one way to look at it. I prefer to think of it as the day our lives started over." A staff member appeared at the rooftop door. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's a family downstairs that just arrived. New residents. They seem pretty shaken up." Harold and Richard exchanged a glance. "We'll be right down," Harold said. As they made their way to the elevator, Richard reflected on how much had changed in a year. The anger and confusion he had felt upon discovering his father's identity had transformed into understanding and, eventually, forgiveness. The emptiness that had haunted him despite his financial success had been filled with purpose and connection. In the lobby, they found a young woman with 2 small children, their belongings in plastic bags beside them. Their faces showed the familiar mix of fear, exhaustion, and fragile hope that Richard had come to recognize in new arrivals. Harold approached them first, extending his hand with a warm smile. "Welcome to Wilson House. I'm Harold, and this is my son, Richard." The woman looked up, relief washing over her tired face. "Thank you," she whispered. "We didn't know where else to go." "You're in the right place," Richard assured her, kneeling to make eye contact with the children. "This is a place for new beginnings." As they helped the family settle into their temporary home, Richard caught his father's eye across the room. No words were needed. Their shared glance conveyed everything: gratitude for their own second chance, and commitment to extending that same opportunity to others. What had begun with a devastating collision on a busy street had become a powerful force for healing, not just for a father and son, but for a community in need of compassion and understanding.